Hey everyone, and welcome back to Fine Print. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about Unit 7, Global Conflict. So to give some context to the global conflict going on in the world in around 1900s, it is important to talk about the shifting of power after the 1900s. This includes the collapse of many empires, most notably the Ottoman Empire and Qing Dynasty China. In the Ottoman Empire, they had experienced struggles since imperialism began, and in response, the empire implemented the Tanzimat reforms. The Tanzimat reforms were a set of reforms aimed to modernize and westernize the empire to better defend against external threats. It also abolished the slave trade, introduced a new legal code, established a centralized bureaucracy. However, they weren't successful, and many subjects rejected the westernization. The Young Turks were a reform-minded Ottoman group of intellectuals that had launched a revolution calling for further reforms and a more representative government. They were successful in overthrowing the government and implemented many democratic reforms. By this point, the Ottomans were hardly an empire and were more of a state. In China, the Qing dynasty faced challenges in the late 19th century and launched the self-strengthening movement to modernize and industrialize China to defend against threats. The self-strengthening movement established modern factories, constructed railroads, adopted Western education and military. However, the government couldn't implement these reforms and faced resistance from Chinese traditionalists. The Taiping Rebellion soon followed. It was a peasant rebellion that sought to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a new dynasty with a mix of Christian and Chinese beliefs. The Qing dynasty eventually suppressed it, but weakened it in the process. Soon followed the Boxer Rebellion, which was an anti-foreign rebellion that was defeated by foreign powers. However, it weakened the Qing dynasty. In 1911, a nationalist party overthrew the Qing dynasty and established a republic. When it comes to describing some causes of World War I, the acronym MANIA can be used. MANIA stands for militarism, alliances, nationalism, imperialism, and the Archduke's assassination. Firstly, militarism was the glorification of military power and the buildup of a country's firearms and power to compete with other nations. It started with Germany, whose naval laws expanded their army. They built dreadnoughts or battleships to counter. However, to counter this, Britain and France soon joined, and the back-and-forth conflict increased tension in Europe. The Schlieffen Plan was Germany's plan of attacking France through a neutral Belgium due to their unpreparedness and sought to quickly end the war. Secondly, alliances were created. To avoid invasion threats, nations established alliances with their neighbors, which guaranteed safety and protection. The two main alliances in World War I were the Triple Alliance, consisting of Austria-Hungary, Germany, and Italy, and the Triple Entente, which was Britain, France, and Russia. Next, nationalism destabilized ethnically diverse nations, as certain ethnic groups within the state wanted an independent country with only their ethnicity. The Balkan Wars are one such example. They were a result of conflicting nationalist objectives between countries in the Balkan region, and alliances further strengthened these nationalist movements. Next was imperialism. The scramble for African colonies destroyed the balance of power established by the Congress of Vienna. Imperialism led to increased competition between major European powers and caused a war centered in Europe to reach the global scale, where colonial subjects fought for the mother country. And lastly, and the most direct cause of World War I, was the Archduke's assassination. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary was shot by Gavrilo Princip, a Serbian nationalist who was part of the terrorist group Black Hand. Black Hand was a Serbian nationalist group whose goal was to create an independent Serb state. Austria-Hungary, backed by Germany, demanded Serbia to hand over Princip. When Serbia refused, Austria-Hungary declared war, and Russia soon mobilized its forces in support of Serbia. Great Britain later sided with Serbia after Germany invaded Belgium. Soon, Japan joined the war on the side of Britain, and the Ottoman Empire and the US soon joined in the years following. When it comes to conducting World War I, it was important to know the two fronts where the war was fought. Firstly, the Western Front was the border between Germany and France. Germany had made significant gains and advanced rapidly into France, but were eventually stopped by both Britain and France, which made Germany fight on two fronts, the Western Front and the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was the Germany-Russia border, which was when Germany was initially successful in pushing back the Russian army, but soon the Russian army launched a counterattack, which was much larger and more effective than the Western Front. Some new military technology was as follows. Underground trench systems were established by both sides along both fronts to protect troops from artillery and gunfire from above, which was known as no man's land. Poison gas, tanks, fighter planes, flamethrowers, machine guns, and submarines were also some examples of new technologies. The concept of the home front also rose during this time period. It referred to the period when the whole country was involved in the war effort, including civilians. The government created production quotas, women worked in the place of men in factories, and propaganda increased to promote nationalism. Food rations were also implemented. The three key battles of World War I were as follows. The Battle of Verdun was a 10-month-long battle between France and Germany, and it ended in a stalemate. The Battle of Somme was Britain and France against Germany, and it led to 5 miles of advancements for the Allies. Battle of Tannenberg was when the Russians badly defeated the Germans, and it exposed Germany's under-preparation. A very important moment in the war was the Russian exit. Russian Tsar Nicholas II abdicated the throne after a massive social upheaval, which diminished the power of the Tsar's government. Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks assumed power in Russia following the Russian Revolution, and the Soviet Union was officially founded as a communist regime. Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which was when Russia exited the war to focus on their internal conflicts, and led to the loss of a lot of territory. United States entry in World War I soon followed. The United States was initially neutral due to their ethnic diversity. However, there were two events that caused President Woodrow Wilson to declare war on Germany. First was unrestricted submarine warfare. The navies weren't allowed to sink neutral merchant ships. However, Germany torpedoed British ship Lusitania, which had US passengers. To further alleviate tensions was the Zimmermann telegram. Germany sent Mexico a telegram requesting them to join the war on the side of the Axis powers and keep the United States occupied. When the US intercepted the telegram, Woodrow Wilson claimed that winning the war was important for preserving democracy. Two key territorial agreements followed after World War I. First was the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Britain and France here decided to partition the Middle East amongst themselves after victory. And next was the Balfour Declaration, which was a formal declaration of British support of a national Jewish homeland in Palestine, and gives further context to the Israel-Palestine tensions today. After the end of World War I, next was the economy in the interwar period. The end of World War I was as follows. The Treaty of Versailles was a post-war conference with Lloyd George from Britain, Georges Clemenceau from France, and Woodrow Wilson from the United States, where the Axis powers were penalized with reparations and the reduction of territories, and established the League of Nations. The League of Nations was an international organization designed for world peace. However, they were largely ineffective. Germany was penalized the worst. They were required to give up Sudetenland and made Rhineland a demilitarized zone. Germany also had to take the blame for starting the war. They had to limit their army, disarm their navy, and became increasingly humiliated, which led to German nationalism. Next came the Great Depression. Europe was stuck in a vicious chain of debt. Allied forces owed each other, Germany and Austria owed them, and they took loans from US banks. Seeing the situation of the strained US economy, foreign investors withdrew their capital, causing a financial crisis in Europe. What followed was the US stock market crash. Investors scrambled to sell their stocks. Thousands of Americans lost all of their money. Businesses went bankrupt and unemployment rates skyrocketed in the United States. The US's economic connection with Europe caused a ripple effect that harmed European economies and exposed the weaknesses of the capitalist system for the first time, which led to many nations changing their economic strategies. What soon followed was the concept of Keynesian economics. It was a theory that the government must stimulate the economy by spending and funding public works projects to lower unemployment rates and restart consumer spending. The New Deal was when US President Franklin D. Roosevelt incorporated Keynesian economics to create a social welfare state. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act was when the United States increased tariffs on imported goods, which encouraged the buying of American goods. Many Russian economic reforms started as Vladimir Lenin assumed power. After the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin assumed power and formally introduced communism. Communism was a political ideology that promoted the creation of a classless society where all property was state-owned and everything was distributed equally amongst citizens. Lenin's new economic policy was a policy that promoted state ownership and some free market economy. It was lenient towards peasants and promoted kulaks, who were wealthy peasants, and brought temporary political stability due to its semi-capital nature. After Lenin's death, Joseph Stalin, another communist, assumed the role of the Russian leadership. He introduced 5-year plans, which were his plans to rapidly industrialize Russian economy through steel and machinery, and farmers were expected to promote agricultural productivity. This period was the collectivization of agriculture, which forced Russian peasants off of their land onto huge collective farms, and this led to massive famine and deaths of many Russian peasants. Along this time period, fascism in Italy rose. Benito Mussolini was an Italian fascist dictator who led Italy during World War II. He introduced a fascist corporatist economy that emphasized state control over private ownership, and he united the interests of the state, workers, and employers. There were many unresolved tensions after World War I. Firstly, the Meiji Restoration in Japan industrialized and modernized Japan, centralized political power, and established a professional army and navy that helped the country partake in international affairs. Japan soon defeated China and Russia in the Sino-Japanese and the Russo-Japanese Wars. During the Great Depression, Japan invaded Manchuria and renamed it Manchukuo, which was a Japanese puppet state. It also led to the Rape of Nanjing, which was when Japan invaded China and slaughtered thousands of Chinese civilians and destroyed many Chinese cities. During this time period, many anti-imperial resistance movements were also prominent. Pan-Arabism echoed the desire of the Arabs to be under a single unified nation, founded on unity and solidarity, self-determination, and cultural pride. In India, the Indian National Congress was led by Mohandas Gandhi. It called for Britain's peaceful departure from India through negotiation. The non-cooperation movement and the Dandi Satyagraha aimed to exert pressure on the British government. In West Africa, there were many conducted strikes against French rule using Western ideas of nationalism, democracy, and colonialism. In West Africa, there were many strikes against French rule using the Western ideas of nationalism, democracy, and anti-colonialism. Next, we go to some causes of World War II. First was the unsustained peace settlement after World War I. The Paris Peace Conference and the Treaty of Versailles didn't solve imperialism problems. They didn't address underlying causes of the war either. France, Britain, and Italy were motivated by self-interest and territorial ambitions rather than peace, which led to many territorial disputes. The existence of mandates gave Hitler justification for his invasion of German-speaking nations. The economic downturn in the US economy also caused a ripple effect in Europe. Germany and the United Kingdom were heavily affected by unemployment and poverty, which sparked social upheaval. This led to the rise of Adolf Hitler. He was the German chancellor of the Third Reich, or the Empire. He formed the Nazi Party in Europe and promised to rid German reparation debts. This led to the rise of many fascist and totalitarian regimes. In Germany, Hitler and the Nazis won German support through propaganda and used illegal means to gain power. They disregarded the Treaty of Versailles and re-established their army and the navy. Neighboring countries were worried about Germany's rapid mobilization, but chose to remain passive. In Italy, Benito Mussolini and the National Fascist Party took control of Italy in the situation of economic and social turmoil. Fascism refers to the promotion of extreme nationalism, emphasis on militarism, a dictator as a leader, a centralized autocracy, and the suppression of opposing beliefs. Mussolini established a secret police force and developed youth organizations promoting fascism. The events leading up to World War II, Japan consolidated its hold over Asia and entered the Berlin Pact. The Berlin Pact was a pact between Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, and Fascist Japan, which were later known collectively as the Axis powers. In 1936 was the German occupation of Rhineland. Under Hitler, Germany secretly reoccupied the demilitarized Rhineland. Soon followed was the U.S. Neutrality Acts, where the U.S. claimed that they held a neutral position in the war, but continued to supply the Allied powers with many food and rations. Next was the Spanish Civil War. Fascist Francisco Franco attempted to take control in Spain politically and overthrow the Republican government. He received much support from Italy and Germany. 1939 was Anschluss, which was when Germany annexed Austria with the justification that the Austrians were practically German because they spoke the same language. Austrians showed no resistance. This led to the Munich Agreement. When Hitler wanted to control Sudetenland, which was a land south of Germany, British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain intervened and made a deal with Hitler that Hitler would stop invading after Sudetenland was invaded. Hitler invaded Sudetenland, but Britain and France followed their policy of appeasement. Appeasement was an Allied policy that attempted to control an aggressor nation, in this case Germany, by negotiating to maintain peace. The Nazi-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact was signed. It allowed Hitler to invade Western Poland and Stalin to invade Eastern Poland, seeing that neither side would stop the other's advances. The official start of World War II was when Hitler violated his promise by invading Poland. Britain and France declared war on Germany, signaling the escalation of a Second World War. As World War II started, many countries began mobilizing their populations. Countries used propaganda as a way to sway populations into their support. They emphasized a threat to national values and freedom, which explained that the enemy posed a threat to these values. By personalizing the war effort, they were able to emphasize the sacrifices of soldiers. Censorship let the government control the narrative and only tell the people what they wanted them to know. Extending propaganda to colonies secured their loyalty to the empire. Germany used Nazism to mobilize state resources for war, and Italy and Japan did the same with fascism. Key events of World War II were as follows. In 1940 was a period known as the Phony War. After Poland fell, Britain and France expected another attack, but for many months Germany appeared immobile. In reality, they were heavily mobilizing their troops. Soon followed was the German invasion of France. The Germans went around the Maginot Line and invaded France. When France surrendered, the Germans bordered British at the French port of Dunkirk. Prime Minister Churchill successfully recovered his troops in Operation Dynamo. 1940 was the Battle of Britain. With the help of the British Royal Air Force, the British defeated the German Luftwaffe. Hitler postponed the invasion of Britain after this battle. Next was Pearl Harbor in 1941. Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. Roosevelt declared war on Japan, and Germany declared war on the United States, which led to the United States declaring war on both Germany and Italy. In 1942, about a year later, was the Battle of Midway, which was a turning point in the Pacific theater. The US Navy defeated Japan by attacking weak Japanese islands. In the same year was Operation Barbarossa. Hitler invaded the Soviet Union, but harsh winters slowed down the Germans. The Soviets, who were used to fighting in cold weather, quickly pushed back the Nazis. And the Battle of Stalingrad was a Russian counterattack that surrounded the Germans and successfully pushed them out of Russia. In 1944 was the Normandy invasion. Through the Allied Operation Overlord, the Allies invaded Nazi-occupied France. Around this time period was the Battle of the Bulge, which was Hitler's last offensive. He managed to create a bulge into France, but was soon ineffective. Also in 1945, in the Pacific Theater, was the Battle of Iwo Jima. The US invaded Japan and foreshadowed Japan's surrender. VE Day in 1945, standing for Victory in Europe Day, was the day when Germany surrendered to the Allies, and Hitler had committed suicide many months prior. Also in 1945 was Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The US gave Emperor Hirohito an ultimatum. After he refused to surrender, the US bombed Hiroshima, and 4 days later Nagasaki, which led to the Japanese surrendering. VJ Day was Victory in Japan Day, was when Japanese surrendered and the Allies officially won the war. Many new emerging ideologies were also prevalent in World War II. In Germany, Adolf Hitler used anti-Semitism to emphasize nationalism, and Hitler was considered a demigod. Anti-Semitism refers to the hatred and discrimination against Jews and the belief that the Aryan race was superior. In Italy, Benito Mussolini's speeches promised a better future for Italy and placed emphasis on state ownership. He also emphasized traditional values like family, religion, and the importance of an agrarian society. In Japan, Emperor Hirohito emphasized cultural values and was portrayed as a divine figure. The military in Japan also played a central role in shaping government policies. In the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin, there was an emphasized centralized government and a classless society, which represented ideologies of communism. The Great Purge was when Joseph Stalin was paranoid that people were trying to overthrow him. He launched a series of purges that arrested, tortured, and executed millions of innocent Russians on charges of spying and sabotaging. Many new military technologies and tactics rose in World War II. The creation of atomic bombs had destructive capabilities for a large area of land, most notably in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Blitzkrieg was a German tactic that translated to swift war. It was a plan to attack the enemy with the army, then artillery, and then tanks, and lastly the air force, which would overwhelm the enemy. The Lend-Lease Act was when initially the US solely shipped food and non-military goods to Britain, but this act made it official that the US could trade military equipment to Britain, which foreshadowed their entrance in the war. Island hopping was a US tactic used in the Pacific Theater to attack weak islands and skip strong ones, making them weaker in the process. Lastly were many mass atrocities after 1900. First was the Holocaust. After the Nazi Party came into power, anti-Semitism grew in Germany and Europe, and discriminatory laws targeted ethnic minorities and Jews. Kristallnacht was when Jewish houses and businesses were trashed, burned, and destroyed, and led to the migration of many Jews from their homeland. Soon, Hitler determined the final solution to Germany's problems, a complete wipeout of the Jewish population. Hitler created concentration camps and sent many Jews to these camps, where they were tortured and killed. The Nuremberg trials were held after Germany's loss in the war. The Allies tried countless Nazis for inhumanity and atrocious crimes against the Jews during the Holocaust. Next was the Armenian genocide. The Ottoman government, under the Young Turks, implemented a plan to deport and massacre the Armenian population in the empire. They conducted forced displacement, seizure of property, sexual slavery, and forced kids to be raised as Muslims. Next was the Holodomor, which was a man-made famine in Soviet Ukraine. It was caused by the Soviet government's refusal to aid any affected areas and continued food exports from Ukraine. Next was the Cambodian genocide, which was the mass extermination of Cambodians by the Khmer Rouge. The Khmer Rouge was a communist regime led by Pol Pot. He implemented a radical and brutal program aimed at creating a classless and agrarian society. The regime conducted mass execution, subjected Cambodians to torture, rape, and execution, forced labor policy, and targeted Muslim and Vietnamese minorities. The Rwandan genocide was the mass extermination of the Tutsi ethnic group by the Hutu-dominated government. Hutus and Tutsis had tension since the Dutch kept the Tutsis in charge of the government, thereby giving them more wealth, respect, and rights, which angered the Tutsis. That is all for Unit 7 Global Conflict of AP World History. If you're enjoying the series, be sure to follow Fine Print for more episodes. And until then, stay tuned for tomorrow, where we cover Unit 8, the Cold War and Decolonization.